It is an honor, and it is especially meaningful for me to have these excellent um, speakers in this panel. The title of our panel is Medicine of the 21st Century, What Role for the Humanities? Um, in fact, we have been talking about person-centered care, and for person-centered care, we know that we need to respect dignity, compassion, we need to promote compassion, and we need to promote respect for the person. And person-centered care has been proposed or has been promoted due to the lack of all the intersubjective dimension that evidence-based medicine has characterized evidence-based medicine throughout these years. The question that I have highlighted for this panel is if person-centered care can be fully implemented without arts and humanities. What are the core skills that a physician needs in this 21st century and in the years that follow? How can the digital technologies interact with health professionals, with patients, with caregivers? And which lens is being used to see and read healthcare in our societies? And to discuss these ideas and other ideas that I'm sure will come up with the intervention of our speakers, we have today Teresa Casal, assistant professor at the Center for English Studies at the University of Lisbon. Her main areas of research are Irish studies, health humanities, narrative medicine, literary translation, and narrative studies. And she has been, Teresa Casal has been studying the intersections between literature, health, and human experiences. So thank you very much for being with us. And we have also Ricardo Ricci, full professor of medical anthropology from the Department of Mental Health, Social Sciences and Humanities, from the Faculty of Medicine of the National University of Tucumán, professor of medicine epistemology. So Professor Ricardo Ricci, as Professor Teresa Casal, are very familiar with academia and with the lectures at universities and with all this relationship. Not only do they study about the patients, but also about the interaction between all the stakeholders in the health context, but they are also familiar with interaction with students and with the relationship with students, which is quite important as well for this symposium. Professor Ricardo Ricci is a professor of bioethics and legal issues, and professor of anthropology and complex systems. So thank you for being with us. I'm going to ask Professor Teresa Casal to start with the presentation. You have 10 minutes for each, 20 minutes. You have 20 or 25 minutes if you need for each presentation. Everyone who is attending this symposium can write the questions, commentaries in the chat. And I will share with our invited speakers if they are pertinent and important questions or commentaries, and then we will open up the discussion to the audience. So the title of the presentation by Professor Teresa Casal is Reconnecting, which is very much related with the opening speech by Jonathan McFarland, reconnecting the humanities and healthcare, the person and the community.
Thank you very much. It is an honor to be part of this symposium, which is so important by bringing together people with a footing in different disciplines, but also learning how to speak across disciplines and do things together at this interface from various disciplines so that we care better for each other and the world. I am now going to share the screen. Okay. I would also like to say that, yes, many of the things that have already been said today relate to, will resonate with my preoccupations and my concerns. And I would also very specifically like to thank Professor Susana Magalhães for inviting me to be part of this panel. It is an honor to share it with Professor Ricardo Ricci as well, whom I salute. And I have to say that I hesitated when I was invited to join a panel to discuss the future of the humanities and health. My hesitation had nothing to do about whether the humanities and health need to work together. I believe we certainly need to reconnect the knowledge that comes from different disciplines so as to live better and care better. My hesitation was about that big word, the future, that inscrutable, shapeless thing into which we project our hopes and our fears. The future is what we take for granted until we don't. Until an accident happens, or we receive a life-changing or life-threatening diagnosis, until disaster strikes in the forms of floods, pandemics, or wars. And though we may be tempted to differentiate between natural disasters such as storms and man-made disasters such as wars, by now we know that even natural disasters have a human hand. The future is therefore what we take for granted until something happens that reminds us of how little control we have over it. The paradox is that we know that the future is uncertain, and yet we live as if it were certain. We know that natural resources are limited, yet we behave as if they were limitless. Is it because we live unthinkingly? Because we fear thinking too much about it? Because thinking about it might make us feel powerless? Because we need a certain lightness of being, as Kundera has put it? Because the future is perceived to be far away and it is easier to carry on with business as usual? Except the future is not far away. Those of us who watched Al Gore's documentary An Inconvenient Truth back in 2006, so 18 years ago, will have noticed that what was the future then is the present now. And that the inconvenience of the truth had to do with what could be done rather than with what could not be done. The question then is how to face inconvenient truths, such as that we all die and resources are limited. How do we face the vulnerability and uncertainty in societies trained to champion mastery and control? I suggest that change starts with a shift in perspective and the willingness to act on it. And that change involves all of us. It just doesn't just happen out there, decided by those in top jobs. It needs to happen at every level, individual and communal, national and international. The encounter between the sciences and the humanities can bring about that shift in perspective. From my experience as a literary scholar working within a medical humanities multidisciplinary team, the project in medical humanities based at University of Lisbon, it is important to note that the shift in perspective starts at home. When bringing my knowledge of literature to the teaching of medical or nursing students, or to facilitate reading and writing groups of healthcare providers in hospitals, two things happen. I am changed as a person, and I am changed as a literary scholar. As a person, I find myself experiencing how the narrative medicine methodology designed by Rita Sharon and her team at Columbia, works on me. I notice what happens when I read together with other people, paying attention to the text and also to my emotions and thoughts as I read the text or watch the painting. When we share our views and discover how the same text or picture is perceived differently by different people, how our personal experience colors our perception. When we then write, not in the usual academic fashion, analyzing a text and displaying our erudition, but when we briefly write to prompts related to the text and allow ourselves to be surprised by what we happen to write on that day in those circumstances. If we are comfortable, we will then go one step further and share what we have written with others, receive their feedback, listen to what they are willing to share with us. In the process, we have gone from being readers to being writers and listeners. Not readers who wish to master a text, and not writers in a creative writing workshop, but people using reading and writing to find out more about others and themselves. Indeed, finding out more about themselves via others, starting with those safe others on the page or on the screen. And sometimes we need a fictional character, for example, to access things within us that are painful, hard to put into words. As a scholar, I find myself asking new questions about how I teach and write about literature. The encounter between healthcare and the humanities has made me aware of how the positivistic stance that was found wanting in medical education has shaped academic knowledge in general, and not just in medicine. And this includes the humanities, so that in literature departments, we have been teaching literature and writing about it in a disaffected and disembodied way, as if we were brains only and nothing else. It has alerted me to how important it is to make room for the multiple layers involved in reading. The affective, which is the most intuitive and immediate one, and which is often repressed in academic settings. The cognitive, the one favored by academia, and the reflective, capable of integrating affect and reason, attention to literature and to its aliveness on its impact on readers. In addition, narrative medicine and medical humanities have allowed me to be present in what I do, both as a person and as a professional. And I think there is a risk when the professional becomes impersonal. There is that risk in medicine, there is that risk in teaching, and virtually in every profession that involves personal interaction. And the risk is eventually also burnout. This is also what the introduction of the humanities in medical education seeks to promote, to allow students to engage in an act of integration, of bringing together their professional and intellectual and existential selves. It is also what narrative medicine workshops in hospitals and patients' associations do, and the effect may be replicated in other areas. The aim is to prompt a crucial epistemic shift. As Morris Spiegel and Daniel Spencer from Columbia have put it, recognition that what one hears in someone else's story can depend on one's own experiences and state of mind, can change everything, can be culture change. And it is culture change to the extent that it makes us aware of the cultural habits and assumptions that have been internalized and of which we are unaware. As philosopher Nicole Piemonte notes, the propensity to ground medicine within a scientific, objective, and anatomobiological worldview is a manifestation of a fundamental and ontological or existential desire to run away from our shared vulnerability of being human. This is not exclusive to the medical profession, but it becomes more noticeable in a profession dealing routinely with life and death issues. Piemonte thus calls for a pedagogy that values the cultivation of the self, openness and humility. And I would say that these ethical concerns should underpin education in every area to promote an urgent epistemic shift. And when she talks about about the fact that we can only ever approach the experience of the other, it means that we're using information, we're using imagination to get as close as possible to the position of the other, in full awareness that we will never fully access it. So we need to be brave in using our imagination to that effect, and humble to acknowledge that we will only ever approach it. So this is then the urgent epistemic shift, from a sense of mastery to an knowledge of vulnerability, from a boundless belief in reason to an awareness of how our reasonings may be colored by our emotions and ingrained cultural values, from a culture that celebrates independence to one that acknowledges interdependence. And this is a crucial epistemic shift, crucial to how we care for humans and non-humans alike. And this picture is from Brazil right now. It is useful to look back before we look forward, to be reminded of what brought the health sciences and the humanities together again, an emerging field of medical and health humanities, before contemplating some of the challenges ahead. In the beginning was post-war American Britain, and a medical practice that was not yet as sophisticated and technological as medicine is nowadays. Now, of course, some decades down the road, someone will be saying the same about medicine as it is practiced today. So in the beginning was that primal scene, the interpersonal encounter between doctor and patient. Let us try to imagine the scene in our mind's eye. There is the patient afflicted with their complaints, the doctor armed with his knowledge and the daily experience of its limits. Was the patient also a person in the eyes of the doctor at a time when doctors visited patients at home? Did the doctor remain a person in the eyes of the patient, or was he too much of a hero to share the ground with the vulnerable patient? In 1953, American doctor-writer William Carlos Williams reminded Robert Coles and fellow medical students that an important part of our lives would be spent listening to people tell you their stories. And in return, they will want to hear your story of what their story means. He argued for the need to foster self-reflexivity, since the more open we are about what gets our moods going and how those moods affect our work, the more likely we are to catch hold of ourselves in the nick of time. Williams's views anticipate concerns in medical and health humanities and narrative medicine. The awareness that clinical practice involves interpersonal and intersubjective exchanges, the co-constructed nature of stories in that exchange, the need for medical students and practitioners to hone their interpretative skills and self-reflexive habits as a means to improve care and self-care, and the awareness of the limits of one's knowledge, which may prevent the dangers of overconfidence in a practice faced with uncertainty. In 1948, again in the US, historian of science George Sarton had coined the term medical humanities. 5 years earlier, William Osler has already been referred had referred to the humanities as the hormones of innovatory thinking that activate new ways of thinking. As noted by Brian Hurwitz, Osler and Sarton were among the early voices pointing out that a positivistic understanding of medicine as a science overlooked the fact that clinical judgment is an applied and interpretative practice exposed to uncertainty and therefore requires what Catherine Montgomery describes as a richer concept of rationality than a spare, physics-based, positivistic account of scientific knowing. Indeed, the failure to question one's assumptions and be alert to potential failures in one's reasoning, such as the suppressive faculty to see the expected and unconsciously dismiss the anomalous, may lead to misdiagnosis and other medical errors, which are predominantly cognitive rather than technical, as has been pointed out by Jerome Groopman. This is what William Carlos Williams had intuited: the need to break old habits and examine what gets our moods going and how those moods affect our work. Developing this kind of self-awareness, he argued, would increase our chances of catching hold of ourselves in the nick of time. He doesn't propose this self-examination as a purely individual endeavor, but talks about being open about it, which would entail a shift not only in individual clinicians, but also in medical culture, to talk about what gets our moods going so as to understand them, to talk about errors or near misses so as to learn from them. Such a shift in the culture is still far from common practice, I would say, to the detriment of the well-being of providers and patients alike. This is where narrative-based practices can be enlisted to make room for a more open and self-reflective culture to emerge. And I'm going to give just two examples. Conversations Inviting Change, as proposed by John Lorner, is a peer-to-peer practice conducted by and for health and social care providers. Narrative medicine, as proposed by Rita Sharon, situates itself within a broader disciplinary ground at the intersection of humanities, the arts, clinical practice, and healthcare justice, with conceptual foundations in narratology, phenomenology, and liberatory social theory. Medical and health humanities provide us not only with methods, which are the ones I've alluded to enable that shift in perspective, but also with conceptual tools and culture-sensitive studies of how stories work, how we make judgments, how power relations operate at interpersonal and institutional level. They also bring more voices into that process of self-reflexivity. Not only the voices of academics from different disciplinary backgrounds, but also the voices of patients, of formal and informal caregivers, as well as artistic representations in various media. For the sake of time, I will single out how epistemic awareness has been enriched by a culture-sensitive conceptual framework derived from law and subsequently applied to healthcare by Javi Carrel. I'm referring to the notion of epistemic injustice proposed by Miranda Fricker and relevant across disciplines. By foregrounding the co-constructed nature of storytelling, Fricker identifies two types of epistemic injustice: testimonial injustice and hermeneutic injustice. Testimonial injustice has to do with the credibility attributed to the listener by the speaker. Is the speaker too young or too old, too sick or too poor to be trusted? Hermeneutic injustice has to do with the absence of conceptual frameworks to interpret a particular story. For instance, to talk about domestic violence in a culture that lacks the concept of domestic violence. Epistemic injustice thus provides conceptual tools for us to become aware of internalized prejudice that may be operating in what we hear or fail to hear in somebody else's story. We see, therefore, that the need to bring the humanities into healthcare had started with the concern about the doctor-patient relation and the need to help medical students engage in self-reflexive practices that might alert them to their thinking habits so that they might check themselves in the nick of time. We see now how over time that process of self-examination has led to awareness of the extent to which we are individual, but also cultural beings, playing multiple roles, carrying assumptions of which we may be unaware, but which nevertheless have an impact in our actions and reactions, in what we do or we fail to do. So moving to my last section, looking forward, the coming together of the humanities and the health sciences provides tools and knowledge for us to approach present and future challenges from diverse perspectives. Such challenges include AI, artificial intelligence, genetics, the end-of-life policies, among others. I will conclude with two cautionary tales about challenges facing societies that are now reaping the benefits of the impressive advances of medicine, and especially Western societies with longevity and increased life expectancy. Both reflections are written out of the experience of caring for parents at the end of life. Both call for forms of awareness that involve everyone, from lay citizens to decision makers. The first testimony by Nicole Piemonte and Sean Abreu indeed echoes the warnings by Martha Nussbaum that have already been mentioned. And it has to do with the risks of trusting healthcare to market logic and the need to regulate, excuse me, to regulate that market logic. They write, it should be said that market logic is so pervasive in medicine that even clinicians in end-of-life care are not impervious to its pressure. While hospice care does not function within a fee-for-service model, and therefore is much less profitable compared to other medical specialties, new for-profit hospice agencies are increasing in number. The vast majority of these for-profit hospice agencies are high-quality, patient-oriented organizations. Yet, as with any market-based system, regulation is necessary in order to prevent self-interested decisions, such as cherry-picking patients who are less sick and thus less expensive to care for, provide subpar services, or engaging in other manipulative practices in order to offer less care to patients as a means of retaining more of the per diem payment that comes from Medicare. Prioritizing profits in the care of the sick is problematic in all areas of medicine, but it is particularly unconscionable in end-of-life care. The second testimony is Sally Magnussen's Southern insight after attending a performance of Shakespeare's King Lear. Having read and seen the play several times before, King Lear's speech now gains additional resonance in light of Magnussen's experience of caring for her mother with dementia. Aware of the challenges that the growing population with dementia and their families face, she calls for a new understanding of community, and therefore reminds us that care far exceeds that original scene that we have revisited of the face-to-face encounter between doctor and patient. It obviously includes that scene, but it also includes all of us in the choices and commitments we make as a society and in how interdependent and co-responsible we are for one another. And I'm concluding with her words. It is when he, King Lear, asks his famous question, "Who is it that can tell me who I am?" that my heart beats faster. In all the times I have read the play or seen it performed, I have never noticed that the question's real focus is on those listening. Who is it among the rest of you, Lear seems to say, can tell me who I am? King Lear is our play for today, a devastating exploration of the human condition for a 21st century struggling as never before with implications of long life. As he starts to lose his sense of self, the old king is pleading for someone to help define it for him. And as if also linking to Indigenous health humanities that Jonathan has just referred, she goes on to write, the Zulus have a proverb, a person becomes a person through other people. The Maoris too are said to consider both identity and memory to reside in the group rather than the individual. What if they are on to something? Might there be a clue here to a new understanding of community? What if our elderly, indeed our mentally frail of all ages, could depend on other people to hold their identity for them, and tell them who they are? What if that were not just an optional social extra, but the very essence of how we are made? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So many ideas here that I'm sure we will have time to discuss. It was a very emotional and very accurate and very rich presentation. And I really would like to underline the importance of all the ideas, but this one, the last one, that we might depend on others to hold our identity, is particularly essential in our days, and I hope we have time to go back to this one. Now, I would like to introduce, and we will discuss and reply to the questions and after the second presentation. I'm very happy to have Ricardo Ricci, who is far away and started his day very, very early to be with us, and particularly interested in listening to Jonathan McFarland. I'm sure you were up very early this morning. And the title of the presentation is Medical Humanities and the Future, an Irrevocable Will for Consolidation.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to say that, yeah, I just wanted to say that Ricardo is going to make his presentation in Spanish, which
Spanish.
is, yes,
Welcome
a
to
pleasure
Spanish.
to listen to Spanish.
Welcome to Spanish. Bueno, estoy muy agradado de participar de este simposio. Digamos, las presentaciones que me han precedido ya me han dado material para pensar por varios días. Voy a comenzar leyendo. Yo no voy a tener una presentación de PowerPoint porque preferí leer y dirigirme directamente con la mirada. Bueno, para mí es un inmenso honor participar de este foro. Por ese motivo, lo que primero que debo hacer es manifestar mi agradecimiento a los organizadores en general y a Susana en particular. Saludo con especial respeto a Teresa Casal. Espero estar a la altura de la jerarquía de la convocatoria de los panelistas y de los asistentes. Además, debo agradecer por la fértil inestabilidad que me produjo el hecho de documentarme y reflexionar a fondo sobre el tema propuesto. En realidad, esto lo destaco porque pensar en el futuro de la medicina, el futuro de las humanidades en la medicina, me ha trastocado la vida durante unos días. Soy un nativo del corazón del siglo XX, por lo tanto, no puedo dejar de ver a la totalidad del siglo XXI como un tiempo por advenir, como un futuro, a pesar de haber recorrido ya casi la cuarta parte de su extensión. Es bueno que la propia zona de confort se convierta de vez en cuando en un tembladeral. Es bueno, claramente, no soy futurólogo, tampoco un eximio lector de los signos de los tiempos. Sí me reconozco un conocedor de las humanidades médicas en el ámbito de la educación médica. Desde esta perspectiva dual de considerar al siglo XX en tiempo futuro desde las humanidades médicas es que encaro la presente exposición. Intentaré compartir con ustedes algunos frutos aún inmaduros surgidos de una extensa y por momentos preocupada reflexión. Estoy convencido de que lo más rico y claro e importante está reservado para el intercambio posterior, cuando ya todo el auditorio pueda oír su voz y compartir nuestras experiencias. La primera parte se denomina perplejidades. El coro de Antígona, tragedia de Sófocles del siglo V a.C., afirma lo siguiente: muchas cosas son asombrosas, pero lo más asombroso es el hombre. Según las fuentes consultadas, la palabra griega deimos, que designa lo asombroso, lo maravilloso, se refiere también, según Heidegger, a lo pavoroso y lo siniestro. El mismo filósofo alemán, hace unos 100 años, afirmó: actualmente la antropología no busca solo la verdad acerca del hombre, sino que pretende decidir sobre el significado de la verdad en general. Y sin embargo, en ningún tiempo se ha sabido menos acerca de lo que es el hombre. En ninguna época ha sido el hombre tan problemático como en la actual. El futuro, el presente, el pasado, en un universo físico tan impasible como insondable, carecen de adjetivos que lo califiquen. Es el hombre el que adjetiva las cosas, los fenómenos y los tiempos. Somos nosotros, los seres humanos, los que vislumbramos un futuro a la vez asombroso y pavoroso. En nuestra tarea de plantearnos el presente y el futuro de la medicina, no podemos ser ajenos a lo magnífico y a lo siniestro. Al inicio de su libro La física del futuro, el japonés Michio Kaku, físico teórico, escritor de ciencia, divulgador científico y profesor de Princeton, propone las siguientes citas. Abro comillas: no creo que al acabar este siglo vaya a quedar sin desvelar ningún secreto relativo a nuestros cuerpos. Por lo tanto, cualquier cosa que lleguemos a imaginar probablemente se hará realidad. Cierro comillas, son palabras de David Baltimore, premio Nobel. Abro comillas: no pienso que haya llegado el momento, pero está cerca. Me temo que por desgracia pertenezco a la última generación que va a morir. Cierro comillas, Gerald Sussman, catedrático de Ingeniería Eléctrica del MIT. Y aún más preocupante, más viejo, pero más preocupante. En realidad, nadie tiene agallas para decirlo, pero si supiéramos cómo añadir genes para fabricar seres humanos de mejor calidad, ¿por qué no habríamos de hacerlo? James Watson, premio Nobel. En este contexto se fue desarrollando el proceso de construir esta contribución al debate de hoy. Se corporizó ante mí la dantesca selva oscura y añoré la presencia de un Virgilio que me ofrezca su guía. Nick Bostrom, un distinguido físico sueco, afirma: si los esfuerzos del desarrollo científico-tecnológico no cesan, entonces todas las capacidades importantes que se puedan obtener mediante alguna tecnología posible serán obtenidas. Se me ocurrió preguntarme la diferencia que habría entre la percepción de futuro que tenían nuestros padres y abuelos con la nuestra. Mi padre nació en el 1924, ahora hace justamente 100 años. Eso me llevó a hacer la siguiente reflexión. Entre 1824 y 1924, la concepción del futuro poseía una alta predictibilidad. No aparentaba representar un problema. La idea del progreso explotó a fines del siglo XIX y marcó un fin de siglo a la vez injusto y auspicioso. Los niños asistirían a la escuela de sus padres. Probablemente ejercerían el mismo oficio o profesión. La medicina poseía escasos recursos y un médico haría más o menos lo mismo que había hecho su maestro. Entre 1924 y 2024, otros 100 años, la cosa cambió de manera radical. Poco a poco se presentaron avances grandiosos en la ciencia, la tecnología, la sociedad y la cultura. Otros presentes y otros futuros se presentaron ante nosotros. Nos vimos en entornos insospechados, en interacciones sorprendentes y rodeados de una tecnología fabulosa. Si bien el futuro se nos presentaba borroso, teníamos algunas constantes de las que asirnos con una aceptable certidumbre. Entre el 2024 y el 2124, el panorama se muestra totalmente impredecible. No hay límites. Como máximo me animo a vislumbrar una perspectiva de 15 o 20 años. El panorama de fines del siglo XXI me resulta totalmente inimaginable e insondable. Cientos de miles de laboratorios de diversas disciplinas se encuentran diseñando artefactos que, integrados, conforman un escenario totalmente impredecible, complejo e incierto que parece diseñarse de manera autónoma. El futuro, el de la medicina incluido, nos anonada, nos empequeñece y nos deja perplejos. El transhumanismo, esa nueva concepción operativa del futuro del hombre, reúne a científicos y expertos procedentes de diversos sectores del saber, inteligencia artificial, neurociencia, nanotecnología e investigadores en biotecnología aplicada. A ellos se unen filósofos y hombres de cultura, con el mismo fin, el de cambiar, mejorar la naturaleza humana para poder eliminar aspectos no deseados y no necesarios, como son el sufrimiento, la enfermedad, el envejecimiento y hasta la condición mortal. No sé a ustedes, pero a mí todo esto me produce una profunda perplejidad. La medicina. A mediados del siglo en curso, la ciencia médica estará muy cerca de poner en manos humanas aquel poder mítico sobre la ciencia y la muerte, sobre la vida y la muerte. No solamente tendrá el poder de curar a los enfermos, sino mejorar el cuerpo humano, incluso para generar nuevas formas de vida. Todo esto no será producto de nuestra fe religiosa, será el milagro de la biotecnología. Los avances producidos y los cambios en el concepto de lo estrictamente biológico impulsaron a que el citado Premio Nobel de Medicina David Baltimore sostuviera lo siguiente: la biología de hoy es una ciencia de la información. De hecho, la biología computacional recurre a herramientas informáticas para ayudarnos a entender mejor los sistemas vivos más complejos, y la computación biológica, cómo podemos utilizar elementos como las proteínas, las moléculas de ADN para procesar y almacenar información. La medicina del futuro inmediato muestra aspectos que es necesario destacar y enumerar. Primero, la medicina genómica. La secuenciación de los genes se encamina a ser un proceso automatizado realizado por robots a muy bajo costo. De ese modo, cualquier ciudadano medio podrá acceder a él. Tendrá acceso a las señas de identidad que definen las características y las firmas genéticas de los organismos biológicos que se hayan inscritas en los ácidos nucleicos. Segundo, la visita del médico o la visita al médico. La interacción del paciente con el médico se modificará radicalmente. La consulta será efectuada en una pantalla que resultará ser una interacción con un programa informático. La aplicación de sensores para las variables biológicas en nuestros cuerpos hará posible anticiparse a cambios en la homeostasis y la aparición de células atípicas, por ejemplo. Eso dará acceso a realizar la corrección inmediata de estos desvíos. La ingeniería de tejidos o medicina regenerativa hará posible la concreción de una especie de tienda del ser humano. Tercero, la utilización de las células madres. Será posible para usarlas para la generación de tejidos, incluso de órganos completos. Será accesible su manipulación a gusto, ya que los avances sobre los mensajeros químicos que deciden los destinos de las mismas hacia órganos específicos estarán plenamente desarrollados. Las células madre tienen potencialmente la capacidad de curar gran número de enfermedades, como la diabetes, las enfermedades cardíacas, la enfermedad de Alzheimer, la de Parkinson e incluso el cáncer. De hecho, es difícil pensar en una enfermedad sobre la que las células madres no vayan a producir un impacto importante. Clonación, cuarto. Los experimentos ya realizados en animales podrán ser aplicados a los seres humanos. Se trata de un proceso avanzado que se haya condicionado a la evolución de trabas jurídicas, éticas y religiosas que actualmente lo limitan. 5. La terapia génica. En un futuro cercano, la terapia génica podrá curar muchas de las 5.000 enfermedades genéticas conocidas, tales como la fibrosis quística, la enfermedad de Tay-Sachs y la anemia de células falciformes. Será posible el tratamiento de numerosas enfermedades genéticas que están causadas por la mutación de un solo gen. Decididamente, uno de los objetivos de la terapia génica es el cáncer. Se sabe que casi el 50% de los cánceres más frecuentes están ligados al daño de un solo gen, el P53. 6. Terapias contra el cáncer. Continuamente aparecerán en el mercado nuevos tratamientos y terapias, todos ellos diseñados para atacar el cáncer en sus raíces moleculares y genéticas. Algunos de los tratamientos más prometedores incluyen la antiangiogénesis, que consiste en cortar el suministro de sangre al tumor, de tal modo que éste no crezca más. Las nanopartículas, que son como bombas inteligentes dirigidas contra las células cancerosas. La terapia génica, especialmente para el gen P53. Nuevos fármacos que actúan precisamente sobre las células cancerosas. 5. Nuevas vacunas sobre los virus que pueden causar el cáncer. Me he limitado a vislumbrar un futuro cercano, como ya dije. Más allá del 2040 o del 2050, no me atrevo a aventurar cosa alguna. Los especialistas manifiestan que será posible la creación de hijos por diseño, dar marcha atrás con el envejecimiento e incluso ir en búsqueda de la inmortalidad. El científico norteamericano William Heisland se animó a sostener lo siguiente: es verdad que se nos acaba la cuerda, pero hemos hablado del proyecto de ser capaces de modificar esto en el futuro. En primer lugar, prolongar la duración de nuestra vida, multiplicándola por 2 y por 3, y quizás, si llegamos a comprender bien el cerebro, hacer que tanto este como el cuerpo entero duren indefinidamente. Y no creo que eso vaya a ser un proceso antinatural. Por último, quiero hacer hincapié en el rol de las humanidades en ese contexto, que es y ha sido mi desvelo, digamos. Mis meditaciones acerca del rol de las humanidades médicas produjeron escasos frutos, a mi juicio algo escuálidos. Con seguridad digo que es un tema absolutamente abierto sobre el que hay que reflexionar permanentemente y sin descanso. Las reflexiones que voy a compartir con ustedes distan mucho de ser un vaticinio profético. Tampoco son las revelaciones de ningún oráculo. Son solo cavilaciones provisorias acerca del rol de las humanidades médicas en el futuro inmediato. A más no me atrevo. Valoro en grado sumo aquella máxima que acaso hoy esté más vigente que nunca. Se aprende del ejemplo y la vivencia más que de los discursos. En educación médica resulta ser una verdad incuestionable, casi un axioma. Primero, estar atentos a que impera la posverdad, esa mentira emotiva nacida para modelar la opinión pública, desdeñando los hechos fehacientes y los datos verificables. Ese modo especial de construir discursos engañosos que llegan a convencer porque resultan atractivos, tranquilizadores o quizás convenientes. Segundo, yo reconozco que me voy a poner un poco polémico. Para el futuro, no hacer. No me puedo imaginar a los grandes filósofos griegos, a los artistas y científicos del Renacimiento, a los sabios y a los poetas, a los dramaturgos de todas las épocas, haciendo algo de lo que hicieron, pensando en nosotros, habitantes del futuro. Escribiendo la Divina Comedia, el Quijote o Hamlet, pensando en los efectos que estas obras tendrían en los habitantes del principio del siglo XXI. Eso me lleva a afirmar que todo lo que las humanidades médicas deban hacer, tienen que hacerlo hoy. Solo desarrollándose libremente y acometiendo con novedad los temas de siempre, influirán en la medicina futura. Valores como la imaginación, la creatividad, la determinación, la oportunidad, generosidad, compromiso, entre otros, permitirán la expansión y consolidación de las humanidades en los contextos médicos. Tercero, no más quejas ni excusas. Sinceramente, estoy saturado y cansado de que los humanistas se quejen de lo que la medicina, habiendo sido, ya no lo sea más. Creo que hay que dejar de culpar a la ciencia y a la tecnología de haber torcido la deriva de lo humano. Si las humanidades desean tener un rol relevante en la medicina del futuro, tendrán que ser propositivas, aportar soluciones concretas a problemas complejos, deberán crear y mantener espacios de reflexión con el fin de que los médicos y la medicina se vean a sí mismos con espíritu crítico. Estos ámbitos de reflexión deben proponerse hasta la saturación en los centros de educación y en los sitios en donde se realiza la práctica médica. Estos espacios de intercambio vital permitirán compartir razonamientos y también emociones, frustraciones, sentimientos, miedos y esperanzas. Los espacios de fortalecimiento de los vínculos han demostrado ser de utilidad en la prevención del agotamiento profesional, en la falta de satisfacción de los médicos, en la violencia contra el personal de la salud y en la competencia descarnada y artera dentro de los equipos terapéuticos. Les recordarán a los médicos que son personas como todas, vulnerables, falibles, llenos de vicios y virtudes. Cuarto, amigarse con las ciencias duras. De una vez y para siempre las humanidades deben aproximarse a las ciencias duras. Deben hermanarse con las disciplinas consideradas básicas y troncales en la formación de los médicos. El planteo del binarismo excluyente debe ser abandonado y caminar de manera concreta hacia una colaboración sinérgica con la clínica. Va a costar, pero el ser humano es uno y debe ser visto como una unidad, conservando y valorando las perspectivas. Esta aproximación permitirá que las humanidades médicas dejen de ser saberes marginales y pasen a ser gravitantes allí donde se las necesita, en las aulas, en las consultas, en los hospitales y en los centros de investigación médica. El tiempo de la interdisciplina ha llegado para quedarse. Los liderazgos compartidos, el diálogo abierto y la potenciación mutua deberían ser cosa de todos los días en la práctica médica. Ha llegado el momento de escuchar e interpretar la voz del paciente, de promover su participación y compromiso en el acto médico. El ciudadano en estado de vulnerabilidad por una enfermedad, esa persona a la que convenimos en llamar paciente, está llamado a enseñarnos abiertamente a ser médicos. Trabajar en terreno heterogénico. Ya voy terminando, Susana. Las humanidades en general, también las médicas, constituyen un terreno decididamente heterogéneo, variado, impredecible y con frecuencia parasitado por las ideologías. Un terreno de interpretaciones disímiles, dispares y hasta contrapuestas, donde la verdad única flaquea y no es bienvenida, en el que necesariamente debe primar la intersubjetividad y la deliberación. Los argumentos y el respeto deben abrir el camino al logro de soluciones consensuadas, alejadas de ese otro binarismo nefasto, el de los ganadores y perdedores. Conociendo el campo de las humanidades, parece casi imposible lograr el beneficio de acuerdos definitivos acerca de toda problemática futura. Creo que sí podemos aspirar a acuerdos marco o a acuerdos muy específicos en situaciones puntuales y precisas. Sexto, dejar las nostalgias de lado. Por ser nostálgicos de un pasado que se fue definitivamente, por sentir saudades de lo que pudiendo haber sido no fue, nos perdemos la oportunidad de mirar hacia el futuro, reconociendo el objetivo básico de una medicina preñada por las humanidades. Salvaguardar a la persona, salvaguardar a todas las personas que se encuentran comprometidas en el acto médico, el paciente, el médico, la familia. Las humanidades deben erigirse en garantes de que la medicina continúe siendo una interacción humana de cuidado. Naturalmente, lo dicho, además de ser reflexiones, son profundas expresiones de deseo. Ya llegará el ventarrón del futuro y lo trastocará todo. Nos tirará todo por la borda. Invitará a los seres humanos o a aquellos que nos sucedan, invitará a los seres humanos o a aquellos que nos sucedan a concebir modos impredecibles de cuidado. Dijo Iñaki Gabilondo en un discurso introductorio al foro del paciente del futuro organizado por Health Thinking. Comillas, vivimos un momento de transformación vertiginosa. Yo lo llamo tiempo de estupor. Alguien dijo que los últimos y lastimeros quejidos de un agonizante se parecen a los primeros bajidos de un recién nacido. Quizás por eso sabemos que un mundo se va y que otro nace, pero interpretamos con dificultad las señales. Para finalizar, comparto con ustedes la parte inicial de un poema de Walt Whitman, que se llama No te detengas. No dejes que termine el día sin haber crecido un poco, sin haber sido feliz, sin haber aumentado tus sueños. No te dejes vencer por el desaliento. No permitas que nadie te quite el derecho a expresarte, que es casi un deber. No abandones las ansias de hacer de tu vida algo extraordinario. No dejes de creer que las palabras y las poesías sí pueden cambiar el mundo. Pase lo que pase, nuestra esencia está intacta. Muchas gracias. Para mí ha sido un honor compartir con ustedes.
Muchas gracias. I know that Ricardo would prefer us to me to ask the questions in Portuguese. So I will, when I come to you, I will ask in Portuguese because I think it is easier. Okay, let's start with. I have 2 or 3 issues here that I would like to ask for your reflection and discussion, and then we will open up to anyone else who would like to comment, ask questions, and so on. Is it okay, Ricardo, if I go on speaking in English?
Yes, yes,
okay?
yes.
Okay.
Please go on.
Okay. Teresa, in your very interesting presentation, as Ricardo has made a brilliant reflection as a doctor, as a professor, as a citizen of this world, with a very optimistic perspective. Teresa, I took note of many of your ideas, and there is one that particularly is relevant for me, which is the shift in perspective and how important the shift in perspective is. And I really believe that narrative medicine and medical humanities can be used and are important for this shift in perspective. Now, Ricardo was polemic, and I'm going to be polemic too, or a bit controversial, which is, for example, thinking about the narrative medicine methodology, close reading, close listening, reflective writing, sharing, this methodology that you have so well pointed out and the effect that it has on you, and it has been on you as a person, as a professional. My question is, how do you see it working on students? How is it that we And I really believe, I'm a believer, following Ricardo Ricci. Last quote, eu creo, eu acredito, Ricardo. So the question is, we believe, we know it has an impact. We feel it has an impact on quite a few persons that also believe and that are also likely to feel this. But my question is, how does it work in this world of the that Byung-Chul Han so well defines in his last book as the world of the crisis of narration?
Mm-hmm.
How is it that we can implement this methodology in the world of the crisis of narration? And what is the feedback that you get from students? I know that it depends on which students we are talking about, which level. But Teresa, I would like to, and then I will provide Ricardo with the opportunity to comment as well.
Okay, thank you for the question. Well, as you know, in Lisbon, with the project in medical humanities started in 2009, and gradually we have been also involved, and it involves people from different areas, including many colleagues from medical school, colleagues nursing, etc., etc. So, and we have been using that kind of methodology in different quarters, in medical school, in nursing, and also, as I said, also in hospitals with groups of healthcare professionals. I should say, to start off, that I came to believe in the method rather than I was not a believer in the method. First, it's not a religion. It's not a religion. So I came to appreciate the potentialities of the methodology the more I engaged with it. And then it was so it was through practice that I came to appreciate, yes, this makes sense. And actually, although Rita Sharon keeps saying that close reading is the signatory method of narrative medicine, as Nellie Herman, the writer in Columbia, points out, and that is certainly my experience, I think it's the fact that the reader becomes the writer that is really the turning point. It's the opportunity to then get from the text or the painting or the film or whatever it is you're all together looking at and engaging with. And then it's turning it back onto you, making room, taking time to write to a prompt and to see what happens, which involves a place of vulnerability because it's unexpected. You have to be receptive. And then, of course, if you will, you might share, etc., etc. So first, I'm not a born believer. I came to believe in the potentialities of the method. Having said that, quite often when we work with colleagues in medical school, etc., even to validate the sheer existence of these elective courses, they need evidence that it works, qualitative studies that it works. I am hugely skeptical of that. It could be because I come from the humanities. I'm not very versed in those methods, which are more prevalent in the social sciences, etc. But my hesitations about those methods, and we have conducted some. You have an inquiry at the beginning and then at the end and so on and so forth. Why am I a bit skeptical about testing this kind of methodology with studies and methods that are designed for other kinds of things? Because I think that first, the narrative medicine methodology is not, it doesn't operate as a mechanism. It's not an automatic thing. You do this and everybody's going to react the same way. You're dealing with people and that's the point. You're dealing with people, each of them with their own characteristics. So some will be more resistant and some will be more receptive So there is that initial attitude that has to do with the life trajectory of each person, with their own personality, with their own circumstances. Usually people in medical humanities also eventually come to medical humanities for some sort of personal reason. So, so the life story, the personal attitude matters, and it's not going to work in the same way with every person. And maybe that's the other point. And I would go back to the quote from Sally Magnuson, in which she says she had read King Lear various times. She had attended performances, and then there was a day when there was a click. Why? Not because the play had changed, but because something had changed within her, and because her experiences had changed. So this is not a one-size-fits-all kind of methodology, but in any case, there has been positive response from medical students. I think the problem is that we only have like an intensive week with them when we have our elective courses. And the positive responses, they find it liberating to have this kind of space to discuss things that they don't discuss in the other courses and the other classes. They find it liberating, and some even say, why don't we do more of this? Because suddenly this is a space of liberation, of feeling free and feeling authorized to talk about things that worry them, concern them, upset them as students, as future doctors, etc., etc. So usually there is a positive response. Although I do have my qualms about using these qualitative methods to test the impact of those methodologies, because I think the impact, because it works at the subconscious level, the impact may not immediately be perceived by those engaging with it. Maybe they will realize it later, but it doesn't mean it is immediately perceived. That's, sorry.
Absolutely. I completely agree. Ricardo, before I pass on, I'm sure Jonathan would like also to intervene. Ricardo,
Susana, por favor.
has dicho que las humanidades tienen que actuar hoy, ¿sí? As humanidades devem actuar, sí. Mi cuestión es cómo, qué deben hacer, o qué deben hacer las humanidades. There is a problem with the connection, I think. Okay, Ricardo.
No, we can hear. No.
Okay.
¿Qué deben hacer? ¿Qué deben hacer? Es un universo de cosas que tienen que hacer. Que pienso yo, ¿no? Tengo de profesor en una universidad nacional, por lo tanto, la cantidad de alumnos hace que se vuelva bastante difícil interactuar con ellos de manera personal, cercana, a donde pueda uno llegar con una voz clara, ¿no? Yo creo que, personalmente, ¿no? Del tiempo que estoy en una facultad, yo creo que lo primero que tiene que hacer una facultad es no destruir al estudiante. ¿Qué significa no destruir al estudiante? El estudiante viene con valores, viene a la facultad con habilidades comunicacionales, viene con empatía, viene con amores, con sensibilidades. Y resulta que la universidad, yo estaba en una cátedra del segundo año y yo tenía coloquios con los estudiantes y observaba todo esto, espíritu de servicio, que por ahí son también frases hechas, ¿no? Pero observaba eso. Y resulta que después daba talleres a los chicos en el último año y me encontraba con robots. O sea, ahí evidentemente había habido una destrucción de la persona. Entonces, lo primero que tiene que hacer la educación médica en general es impedir, a eso me refería con el no hacer, es preferible no hacer que destruir, ¿no? Bien. Segundo, otra cosa que nosotros hemos llegado, que lo dije en esta pequeña charlita, es ese hermanarse con las clínicas. Si las humanidades médicas ya lo hemos comprobado hasta el hartazgo, con cine debate, con narrativa, con role-playing, con habilidades comunicacionales, con esto, con lo otro, con esto. Si no se juntan con las clínicas, es imposible. Hemos tenido experiencias, por ejemplo, en la construcción de las historias clínicas, en la materia de semiología propedéutica,
Ah,
instándolos a los chicos a hacer historias clínicas teniendo en cuenta la perspectiva narrativa, de escuchar la historia. Y no solamente eso, sino de escuchar el contexto sociocultural del paciente y valorarlo. Pero para lograr eso, primero hay que, lo voy a decir gracioso, la noche anterior hay que asaltar la casa del profesor de semiología y atarlo a la cama para que él no pueda, para que él no pueda asistir
oh,
el día
Ricardo,
siguiente, ¿no?
we can also, también podemos invitar al profesor de semiología
Sí.
para enseñar
Sí.
semiología de una otra forma, paralelo
No, ya sé.
con...
Sí,
No,
sí, sí.
Estoy
semiología
exagerando.
y después,
Estoy
semiología
exagerando.
y después una
Estoy-
aula de literatura
Estoy-
sobre, por ejemplo, de Gavin Francis,
Yep.
usando los libros de Gavin Francis para
Está
ayudar
bien,
todos.
estoy de acuerdo. Estoy de acuerdo, lo tuyo es extremo. También se puede invitarlo a tomar
Sí.
un vasito de
Una caña.
cicuta minutos antes de...
Ricardo,
Bueno,
sí.
no, es eso. Y después, perdón, y usé una palabra
sí.
que en la charlita, a la cual yo le doy mucha importancia, que es saturar de oferta de humanidades médicas. Saturar. Cine, charla, conferencia, invitado, propuestas, talleres, teatro, pum, 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 pum. Permanentemente saturar de oferta.
Jonathan, just thank you so much. It was very important. Just one more question to Teresa, related with what Ricardo has just said. The proposal is to set up this dialogue and this interconnection, not only connection, but interactivity with the so-called hard sciences, whatever that is, because I really have some doubts about soft and hard. Okay, but do you think that, for example, thinking about Portugal, do you think that there is openness, which was one of the concepts that you have highlighted? Is there openness from the faculties of medicine, from hospitals, from healthcare institutions, is there openness to medical humanities, or what do you think?
From our experience, there is increasing openness.
Good.
There are increasing demands from colleagues in medical schools. There is a turn of generations as well, and clearly there is greater openness to that. I would go back to, and you know, we have more and more requests for collaboration. Is the connection bad?
No, I'm just listening to some noise. I don't know where it comes from. But
so I think there is increasing openness, but I would go back to the amigarse, hermanarse that Ricardo mentioned, to say, and also to saturate, because I think the critical thing of these methodologies is a regular exposure, a regular engagement with them. If we are going to operate a shift in perspective, it means...
there is someone intervening here. I'm sorry. Okay. Sorry. Go on, please.
So if we're trying to break old habits, we need to create new habits. And to create new habits,
Yes.
it takes a shift in perspective and then the habit of doing it so that it becomes internalized. So that's going back to William Carlos Williams. So you need to create new habits so that in a situation of crisis, the new habits will take over. The new habits, you will then react in a different manner. But it means training them. So it's a humble job. It isn't done just one-off. It's humble. It needs practice, and it needs you need to change old habits with new habits, and new habits that come together with this awareness of what was wrong about some of those old habits.
Thank you so much. I will give Jonathan also the opportunity to ask a question or make a comment. Just one thing that I think is really, really important. At the end of your presentation, Teresa, you said, what if we need others to hold our identity? And I really think that this should be written on the walls of faculties and hospitals and schools and so on, because we face a challenge regarding artificial intelligence. We are having a lot of guidelines, how to develop, how to implement, how to use ethical guidelines for AI. The fact is, for me, they are very important, but useless if we don't seize the opportunity to reflect upon our humanity. What are we doing? Because if we need others to hold our identity, are we going to, do we think that the screens will do that, that the robots will do that? So,
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Which is why I think that reminder by Magnusson is really very, very important. And I think we will, small children need others to hold their identity. With some disabled persons need others also to hold their identity. Certainly when we are very seriously, very severely ill, then we need others to hold our identity. And in the case of dementia, that kind of brings it home to you. And a lot of end-of-life care, etc. And we need others to hold our identity. So we need to be there to hold other people's identity so that and it's this, again, it's okay, to say a paradigm shift is a very big word, but it's a cultural shift. Because instead of control, mastery, and autonomy, which is what our Western society is predicated upon, heroes, autonomous, independent, we really need to come, and that I think that's where the medical humanities need to speak from a place of vulnerability. It is crucial to acknowledge that shared vulnerability, and it all needs to come from that. And I think that's where Ricardo also said that about person to person. So we're all the doctor and the patient and whoever is interacting, but it all needs to come from that place of shared vulnerability. I didn't specifically go into artificial intelligence because I don't know a lot about it. So
that's shared vulnerability.
Yes.
We don't know a lot about it. That's our shared vulnerability. Okay, we are almost, unfortunately, because I would spend my whole morning here with you. Jonathan, would you like to, we have, I believe, because we have to be very strict with time, we have 5 minutes. Would you like to ask any question, make any comment, please?
Well, I mean, thank you very much, Susanna. Thank you, Ricardo, Teresa, for your fabulous ideas. There's so many ideas running around in my head that it's like Plato with the birds in the cage, or like Nabokov with the butterflies in the net. You know, the ideas spinning around. But I, Ricardo, estoy completamente de acuerdo contigo en que las humanidades médicas, primero, no son separadas de la medicina y nunca tienen que serlo, y tenemos que integrarlos. Tiene que ser integrado la medicina y las humanidades. No son aparte. No eran aparte en la historia y son aparte desde hace 50, 60, 70 años. Okay, so the integration of the humanities into medicine is critical. Now, not only the subjects of humanities, but humanism per se, because humanities are subjects like anthropology, literature, Teresa spoke so beautifully about, art, etc. But doctors, senior doctors, are models for junior doctors and for students. The students can learn more from their mentors or the older doctors. If they see that the mentor or the older doctor is working with humanity towards the patient. Now, I will give you an example. Susana knows. Dr. Manuel Pera. Professor Manuel Pera is professor of surgery, but he always goes to see his patient before the operation. If it's necessary, hold the hand of the patient. If it's necessary, touch the arm of the patient. If it's necessary, speak to the patient as long as the patient needs. He will do this. And then he will do it afterwards when the patient is recovering. A good doctor is the doctor who looks after the patient throughout the whole process. We're not always going to cure patients. As Teresa was talking about the importance of, well, I think taboo, death is a taboo still to be talked about. We don't talk about it enough. And I remember some 15 years ago with doctors from different specialities talking about death with the doctors for 2 hours. And one of the head of the emergency department said, it's the first time we talk about this. So it needs to be integrated. But I also would like to comment on Ricardo, what Ricardo said. Los alumnos que vienen con el primer año tienen ilusiones de ser buenos médicos o médicas, doctoras, tienen mucho entusiasmo, tiene ese idealismo de ayudar a la gente, y el sistema se matan esto, se escriman, se quitan este deseo. Entonces, medical humanities, I don't like necessarily the term medical humanities. Humanism in general needs to be integrated from the beginning to the end. And this is so important, Susana.
Thank you.
So important.
Thank you, Jonathan. This is really important. I just wanted in 2 short sentences, Ricardo, if you could tell us, how do you see bioethics inside of these humanities? Because you are also, you talked about bioethical issues, terapia genética, what was células madres, células madres. Entonces, ¿cuál es el papel, el rol, how do you say, el rol de las humanidades, papel de las humanidades, de la bioética?
Sí.
We have 1 minute.
1 minute.
Perdón. Justo antes de, bueno, mientras pensaba la charla de hoy, hice una encuesta que tuvo cerca de 40 respuestas. Y ahí salieron 2 cosas interesantes relacionadas con lo que estamos hablando, ¿no? La primera es que ante la posibilidad de elegir qué humanidad médica, cuál de las humanidades médicas sería relevante para el futuro y para la educación médica, bioética es excluyente. Es la primera en cantidad de votos. Y la segunda es las habilidades comunicacionales. Y la tercera son las habilidades narrativas, ¿no? Así que ahí, digamos, eso te puede dar un indicio, digamos, de lo que, digamos, yo nunca lo quise aceptar porque no era profesor de bioética en la facultad, era profesor de antropología médica.
Mhm.
De las humanidades médicas, la que lleva la bandera es la bioética. O
Sí,
sea,
Sí,
cierto,
las
es
demás,
porque
las demás se van a encolumnar por detrás.
cierto.
sí. Because narrative medicine, medical humanities are always dealing with ethical issues and are also addressing ethical issues. Always. I think this is why I completely agree with Teresa that we learn to believe by the practice, and this practice addresses self-identity issues, hetero-identity issues, and ethical issues are always there because communication raises ethical issues. So it is the bioethical reflection not only is answered also by the tools of narrative medicine, at the same time, narrative medicine and medical humanities also raise ethical issues in their practice. So this interaction is really relevant, and I think this is really important.
Yes, ahí, perdón que una cosita.
Sí, sí,
una
sí.
cosita. En
Sí.
esa misma encuesta salió una de las, por supuesto había respuestas así de expresión de deseos y superficiales, pero salió en 2 o 3 respuestas que para los que nos dedicamos a las humanidades médicas, señores, han fracasado. Cambien del modo de enseñar las humanidades médicas. Clarito, ¿no? Ese es uno.
Claro.
Está bien, está bien, está bien.
Y dos, con respecto a la bioética, todo este aporte de la bioética narrativa es algo muy interesante.
Sí,
Creo
sí,
que le da una vuelta de tuerca más a la bioética, integrándola a la clínica.
sí.
I completely agree. William
too.
Osler said 100 years ago, talked about science and the humanities as twin berries on a tree. They
Yeah.
should never have been separated, and we need to rejoin them again.
Susanna,
Thank
sorry.
you. Yeah,
Sorry.
we are and
It
closing
is
now.
very interesting indeed, but we have to finish.
Yes, we are closing. So thank you so much for your excellent contributions. There is a coffee break now till 12.
Yes.
And then at 12 there is the panel 2, which with the title Healthcare, Biomedicine and Ethics, which I'm sure will be very interesting. Thank you.
Muchas
Thank you,
gracias.
Susana.
I'm going to sleeping.
Muchas gracias. Ricardo,
Gracias.
encantado. Teresa.
Yeah.
Good rest. Okay. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much.